All right, so let's jump right in. We're really diving deep today into Kamala Harris's political future after, her loss to Donald Trump in 2024.
Yeah,
And you sent me some really fascinating articles and research about this whole thing.
right.
And I think the thing that's so interesting is she's in this very unique position right now,
Right.
having to preside over the certification of her own defeat as vice president.
Absolutely, yeah.
So has any other vice president actually ever been in this situation?
Well, there have been a couple. Al Gore and Richard Nixon both presided over their own defeats,
Okay.
but they were outgoing vice presidents.
Oh, interesting.
So Harris is still in office for 2 more years.
Okay.
What's interesting is how both Gore and Nixon
Mm-hmm.
really used this certification moment to send a message about, what their intentions were for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Gore was, incredibly stoic and dignified, almost like he was already looking ahead to a potential 2004 run.
Right.
Nixon, on the other hand, appeared quite somber,
Yeah.
almost defeated.
Oh,
It really makes you wonder how Harris will approach this and, what it might signal about her plans.
that's a great point. It's not just like a procedural event. It's a chance for her to kind of like frame her own narrative.
Exactly.
So before we even get into what she might do, let's unpack why she lost this election.
Right.
The sources seem to point to a few key factors, starting with Biden's late withdrawal from the race.
Yeah, Biden's decision definitely threw a wrench into things for the Harris campaign.
Right.
Remember, he held on to a lot of that incumbency advantage
Uh-huh.
and that loyal voter base that Harris hadn't quite solidified yet.
And it seems like the sources kind of delve into how this impacted her strategy.
Right.
Like she essentially had to shift from running against a crowded field of Democrats
Yeah.
to taking on an incumbent president in just a few months.
Yeah,
That's got to be tough.
really tough. It's
Yeah.
no easy feat.
Not at all. And the sources also highlight that she kind of underperformed with some key demographics,
Yes.
particularly Black and Latino voters, compared to Biden's success with those groups in 2020.
Right.
But I feel like there was some conflicting data on that. I recall one of the sources mentioned Trump's own pollster actually noted she performed better than expected
Yeah,
amongst certain segments of those same demographics on issues like the economy.
that's right. And it's a detail I think that shouldn't be overlooked
Right.
because it suggests that while she might not have, won them over entirely, she did make some inroads.
Mm-hmm.
And this could be really significant for her future prospects,
Yeah.
depending on how she chooses to leverage those connections.
So taking all of that into consideration, what are her chances if she decides to run again in 2028?
Well, I think she has a lot going for her. Name recognition is huge,
Yeah.
and she already has an established support base from her previous campaigns. Plus, she has the potential to really unify the party, especially if she can successfully bridge those gaps that we saw in this election.
But she'd also be running in Biden's shadow, right? I mean, how does she even differentiate herself from his legacy while still appealing to his base?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And the sources suggest that, a new generation of Democratic leaders could emerge as serious contenders.
Oh, interesting.
Names like Governors Whitmer, Pritzker, and Newsom were all mentioned as potential rivals.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Each brings their own strengths and, connections to the table.
And of course, we can't forget about the Trump factor.
Right.
Even if he doesn't run again, his influence on the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
And, the political landscape is undeniable.
It's huge. His unpredictable nature adds another layer of complexity to, Harris's potential path back to the White House.
Yeah.
So while a 2028 bid is certainly possible,
Mm-hmm.
it's far from, a guaranteed path to success.
Right. So maybe she should consider setting her sights on California instead.
Yeah, maybe. Let's explore that option a bit.
Okay. The California governor option. What do you think?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because California is such a powerhouse state
Yeah.
with a national platform.
Uh-huh.
Becoming governor would be a significant achievement in itself
Right.
and could be a powerful springboard back to national politics.
And the sources pointed out the historical significance of her potentially becoming the first Black female governor of California.
Right.
That's a really powerful image, especially in contrast to a Trump presidency.
Absolutely.
Right.
California has often been at the forefront of pushing back against Trump's policies.
Right.
A Governor Harris could really take a lead on issues like climate change, immigration, and healthcare,
Uh-huh.
setting a national example.
That's a great point, but it wouldn't exactly be a cakewalk, would it? I mean, what are some of the hurdles she might face?
Well, stepping back into state-level politics would mean leaving the national stage, at least for the immediate future.
Right.
And she might even have to contend with Newsom's own political ambitions,
Uh-huh.
assuming he's still aiming for the presidency.
So even the California option comes with its own set of, complexities
Okay.
and potential roadblocks.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot to consider.
There is. And it's important to remember that these aren't her only options.
Right.
The sources also suggest some alternative paths for Harris to explore.
They do. Let's take a look at those.
Okay. What other possibilities are out there?
Well, she could potentially serve in a cabinet position in a future Democratic administration.
Okay.
Secretary of State or Attorney General were specifically mentioned.
Uh-huh.
Both roles that would really allow her to leverage her experience and expertise on a national level.
Okay.
Or she could lead a foundation or institute focusing on issues that she's, passionate about.
Right.
Like criminal justice reform or women's rights.
So she could use her platform to advocate for change from outside the government.
Exactly. And the sources also suggest the possibility of a global role.
Okay.
Maybe tackling a specific issue like climate change or human rights on the world stage.
That's interesting. With her experience as vice president and her international connections,
Right.
she'd be pretty well positioned to take on a global leadership role.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, there's always the private sector.
Right.
Many former politicians transition to successful careers in business consulting or public speaking.
So her options really are wide open.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like she's at a crossroads
She is
with the potential to go in any number of directions.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And it really feels like we're watching this kind of shift in the political landscape right now.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think back to the whole resistance movement
Oh, great.
that we saw after Trump's win back in 2016.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that this movement, which, once felt so powerful,
Mm-hmm.
is starting to kind of fade away a little.
It definitely feels like it's not as prominent as it once was.
Mm.
Back then there was this almost visceral reaction to Trump's election,
Yeah.
especially among Democrats.
Mm.
It was all about, mobilizing against his policies and rhetoric.
Right.
Protests, marches, social media campaigns, all about resisting.
And now it seems like there's this growing feeling that maybe that approach isn't working as well as it used to. Trump's base is pretty solid at this point.
Right.
And it seems like those who oppose him are looking for, new strategies.
Exactly. The sources suggest that there's this real shift happening within the Democratic Party,
Okay.
a move away from just straight-up opposition
Uh-huh.
and towards a more strategic and even like a conciliatory approach.
Okay.
It's less about just saying no to everything
Right.
and more about trying to find common ground
Yeah.
where possible,
Mm-hmm.
building coalitions and focusing on issues that can really connect with a broader range of voters.
So it's about adapting to the current political reality.
Yeah,
And figuring out how to be effective in that context.
exactly.
And it makes you wonder if this kind of shift could actually open up new possibilities for someone like Kamala Harris.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
If the Democratic Party is moving away from this resistance mindset,
Yeah.
it could create space for leaders who are really good at, bridging divides
Right.
and appealing to a larger audience.
Mm-hmm.
And Harris, with her experience and her ability to connect with lots of different communities,
Yeah.
could be really well positioned to navigate this new landscape.
Definitely something to think about. But going back to her immediate future, the sources highlight that Harris is taking a very proactive and resilient approach to this loss.
Oh, absolutely.
She doesn't seem to be dwelling on it at all.
No.
She seems to be looking ahead
Yeah.
and focusing on what she can do right now.
Right. One quote from her that really stood out to me was, "We are not having a pity party."
Wow.
It really shows her mindset and her determination.
Yeah.
And another source, I think she emphasizes the need to stay in the fight,
Uh-huh.
which suggests that she's not giving up on her vision for, a more just and equitable society,
Right.
even after this setback.
It's a pretty powerful message.
It is.
And it says a lot about her character.
Yeah, I think so.
She's not letting this loss define her.
Right.
She's using it as fuel to keep moving forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It brings us back to that central question we've been talking about.
Yeah.
What path will allow Kamala Harris to have the biggest impact?
Right. It's a question that comes up again and again in these sources.
It does.
And I think it's one that really deserves a deeper look.
I agree.
We've talked about the possibility of another presidential run.
Yeah.
Maybe becoming governor of California,
Yeah.
the various cabinet positions she could fill, and even a role on the global stage.
Yeah.
But one of the sources brought up this really intriguing question.
Okay.
What about transitioning to the private sector?
That's interesting.
How might that impact her identity
Yeah.
and her future aspirations?
It's not something we typically think about when it comes to politicians leaving office, right?
Right.
We usually think of them staying in the public eye,
Yeah.
whether it's through government service or advocacy work
Mm-hmm.
or even, media appearances.
Right?
But the private sector is a whole different ballgame.
It is. It makes you wonder how that shift would affect someone like Harris. I mean, she's
Yeah.
dedicated her entire career to public service.
Right.
Would she even be able to make the same kind of impact in the corporate world?
Hmm.
Or would she feel limited by that environment?
It's a good question. And how would it affect her public image?
Right.
Would people see it as selling out
Yeah.
or as a strategic move to, gain new experiences and resources
Uh-huh.
that she could then use to benefit the public?
It's complicated.
It is. It's a really complex question.
Yeah. And it really highlights the unique challenges and opportunities
Right.
that someone like Harris faces
Yeah.
as a woman of color who has achieved such a high level of political success.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The sources don't really give us a clear answer,
Right.
but they do give us something to think about.
They do. One expert suggested that moving to the private sector could allow her to build, a financial base
Yeah.
and expand her network, which could be valuable if she ever decides to get back into politics.
Yeah, it makes sense. She could use her experience and connections
Mm-hmm.
to advocate for change from within the corporate world.
Right.
Or she could use her resources to support causes she believes in.
But another expert also warned that going to the private sector could hurt her reputation,
Yeah.
especially among progressive voters who
Mhm.
might see it as a betrayal.
Yeah. It's a tough call.
It is. It really emphasizes the fact that there's no easy answer
Right.
to the question of what will give Kamala Harris the biggest impact.
Yeah.
It's ultimately her decision
Mm-hmm.
based on her values and goals
Right.
and her understanding of where we are politically right now.
It'll be interesting to see what she does.
It will. And I think a lot of people will be watching her decision very closely.
Absolutely. Her choices could affect the whole Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And even beyond.
But no matter what she decides, I think it's safe to say that Kamala Harris is a force to be reckoned with.
I agree. She's a trailblazer.
Yeah.
She's resilient, and she's definitely not done making her mark on the world.
So before we wrap things up, I want to hear from you, our listener.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about all of this?
What path do you think would allow Kamala Harris to have the biggest impact?
Should she run for president again?
Aim for the California governorship.
Maybe pursue a cabinet position?
Take on a global role?
Or explore those opportunities in the private sector?
Or is there something else entirely that we haven't even considered?
We really want to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts.
Share your ideas on our social media.
Or leave us a voicemail.
We'd love to keep this conversation going.
And really dig deeper into all the possibilities for Kamala Harris.
Yeah, it really is amazing to think about all the different paths that are in front of her. I'm especially intrigued by this idea of her going to the private sector.
Right.
It's such a change from, her whole career in public service. But it could be a really smart move.
It really could. It would be so interesting to see how she'd handle that world. Yeah.
Would she go for, like, a company that's all about social impact? Or maybe use her, platform to push for change
Yeah.
from inside a more typical corporation?
Right.
It's a side of Kamala Harris we just haven't really seen before.
And it kind of speaks to a bigger point that keeps coming up in this deep dive.
Uh-huh.
How leadership is changing. That old way of climbing the political ladder doesn't seem to fit anymore.
You're right. We're seeing leaders come from all these unexpected places these days.
Yeah.
Business activism, even entertainment.
Right.
And they're using their influence in completely new ways.
It makes you wonder if traditional political roles will even matter as much to the next generation. Maybe we'll see this shift to more fluid and dynamic leadership.
It's definitely possible. And I think someone like Kamala Harris, with all her experience and her, willingness to break the mold,
Yeah.
she could be leading that change.
Yeah, she doesn't really fit neatly into any one category, does she?
Not at all.
We've talked about her political ambitions and her commitment to social justice and how she bounces back from setbacks. And now this possible move to the private sector.
Right.
She definitely isn't afraid to make her own path.
That's what makes her story so interesting.
Yeah.
She's not just another politician.
Right.
She's a leader who's constantly changing and adapting to the world around her.
I have a feeling we'll be hearing about Kamala Harris for a long time.
I think so, too.
Her story's not over yet, and I can't wait to see what she does next.
Me neither. And remember, everyone, this conversation doesn't stop here. Keep thinking about what we talked about today.
Yeah.
Look into those sources we mentioned
Hmm.
and share your own thoughts and ideas.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
It has for me too.
We got to go beyond just the headlines and really get a deeper understanding of Kamala Harris, where she stands now, and all the complex things that are shaping her future.
Right.
It's clear she's at a turning point in her career,
Yeah,
and I'm really excited to see where she goes from here.
I agree. It reminds us that even with political losses and all the changes happening around us, there's always room for growth and change and making a difference.
That's right. Kamala Harris's story is far from over.
It is.
And I think she's going to keep surprising us and inspiring us for years to come.
I think you're right.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Kamala Harris's political future. It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
Yeah, it has.
And we encourage you to keep researching, keep thinking critically, and keep having those important conversations about the things that matter most.
Until next time, everyone stay curious and keep learning.